Okay, so today we continue talking about our introduction to object-oriented programming, and I would like to make you more familiar, أكثر ألفة يعني, with reading and understanding code that contains classes, code written in C++. So we're going to continue talking about the different ways, the different styles in defining a class. Then I'm going to illustrate the abstract concept we talked about last time, which is data abstraction. We talked about it abstractly last time. تكلمنا بصورة نظرية regarding data abstraction encapsulation. But today I would like to give you an example that illustrates how data abstraction minimizes, تقلل from the effort that is done in modifying an existing code. As we are seeing different programs, we are going to see how to define member functions inline, using the inline approach, or using the scope resolution operator, so that you are able to read C++ code that has classes written in different ways. Okay, because as we said before, C++ is a free format language. So there are different ways of writing the same code. So I want to make you familiar with different C++ code, so that we can start tracing and writing code by ourselves after we get familiar with this code, after this two-lecture introduction. This is the last lecture from last slide from last lecture. In the previous lecture, we stopped here. Defining what is a class, member variables, member functions, access specifiers. So let's talk again about this example before we proceed. Do you remember this? Yes ولا بس كده امتحانكم؟ طيب. First thing, what did we say? We have a class definition. خلاص? Class definition is class is a reserved, is a private keyword, not allowed to be used as an identifier like a variable name or a function name. You cannot call a function name class. What does this class define? It has data members or member variables, and it has member functions, which we called methods last time. Do you remember? عليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. جزاك الله كل خير. هدية بسيطة قبلها منا. شكرا. الله يخليك. اشتغلت البروجكت احنا نقول دلوقتي ممكن تصير البروجكت معايا. We talked about methods, yes, and data, and we said that the class encapsulates تحتوي على تضم يعني في مكان واحد data fields and the related functions, the functions that access, that deal with those data fields. So in that case, we had two functions for each data field. Let me draw them in different colors. So this function deals with the name field, and this one too. Okay? And the functions here in green, they access the grade field, and this one also access the grade field. So for example, the function setName, the function setName takes a value from the main program, from outside the class, then it is passed inside the class through عن طريق the member function set name. And then through the name, it is through the parameter n, it is stored inside the private member name. Then it is copied here inside the name. Why all this path? Why do you follow all this path instead of directly writing inside the name? So we said this is what object-oriented programming achieves. It achieves the privacy, the abstraction of the data. So the data is hidden inside the class, and we can only access this data by the help of a public member function. So you need a public member function. Yes, one of the ways is to let your data also public, but in that case there is no purpose of using classes. If everything is public, then the code becomes regular modular programming that has its problems when you need to update or to modify the code later on. And the getName function does exactly the opposite. The getName function can access this private data member name. Why? Because it is a member of the same class. Then it returns that name where? Outside the class. So the getName function is a member function that is allowed to access private data, which in that case is the name data, and returns it outside. So if we can imagine that this is the class, for example, the class has private data, two private data fields. One is the name, and one is the grade, for example, G. And the main function is outside the class. So to be able to access the data, the private data, the abstract data inside the class, so this is the whole class, it is going to access it through the public interface عن طريق واجهة التعامل العامة. So I take, for example, the name Ali, and I put it here in the function, and the function moves it here in the name. If I want to do the opposite, I read the data field through another member function, and that other member function can pass it outside to the main function. So this is how the classes object-oriented style of coding works. So that if I need to make any changes here in the private data, do I need to make changes in the main function? No. I only modify the public interface. How about the main function? It remains the same because it is dealing only or directly with the public interface, but not directly with the data. So indirectly with the data. So in that case, I don't need to make any modification outside. I restrict, نقوم بتحديد modifications and changes just inside the class, and the rest of the whole program remains the same. واضح؟ Let's look at another example that also shows the encapsulation concept of object-oriented programming. What does encapsulation mean? It means both data and related functions functions are grouped together inside one object, inside one entity called the class. The data and the functions are together inside the class. So here we have a class also, and I would like to show another way of defining a class. In the previous class, we had grouped all the public data together and all the private data together. Here we had all the private section all together and the public section all together. But it is allowed to make more than two sections. I start with a private section. How do I know this is private even though I did not write the word private? Because the private yes, the private access specifier is defined by default. So if I don't write anything, everything in the class becomes private. And then I have a public section. How do I know that the public section ends here? Because later on I have another private access specifier. This private access specifier acts يقوم بالتعامل only until this line, until it finds another access specifier, public. So you can put as many sections as you want. In this style of programming, I put everything inside the class. Okay, let's remove this. So I put first a data field name and all the functions that handle this data field together in one block. And not only that, the definitions also of the functions. So everything contained inside the class. And then another data field together with the functions that deal with this data. So in this writing style, I'm putting the related information together. Data and functions, data and functions. And also I put the function definition, the full function definition inside the class. What do we call this? Inline function definition. Inline function definition. This is one of the ways to write classes. In the previous one, in the previous slide, the functions were also inline. So the functions were inline. But all the private data was grouped together, and all the public data, public member function in that case, were grouped together. Is there another way to write this? Yes, another style of writing is the smallest class size possible. For example, in this class, I put the minimum possible information. Some people prefer to have their classes short. This is also one style of writing. So how do you make it short? By grouping all the private data together and putting them at the beginning. Why does it become shorter, fewer lines of code when I put the private data at the beginning? Because I don't need to write the private access specifier at the beginning. Because if I don't put private, what is the default? The default is private. So by putting all the private data at the beginning, I don't need to write any private. Second thing, by putting all the public together, I don't need to repeat the public access specifier every time. So one of the ways is to make the class self-contained, everything. This is one of the styles of writing. But the style that you will find most often is this one. Put the private section all together at the beginning, so you don't have to write the word private, and save one line. And then put all the public together, so that you don't have to repeat the keyword access specifier public. The second comment about this class definition is that I have put the function headers only. What is the definition of the function? Not inside the class. So what do we put at the end of the header? Semicolon, 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 semicolon. So when we put those function headers, it means that those functions are members of this class and they are public. This is everything we are saying. But what do those functions do? We're not telling the compiler what those functions do. In the previous way of writing, where everything is contained inside the class, we also write inside the class the inline function definition. For example, what is this function doing? Set name. It just takes a string n from outside the class, from the main, and then it stores it in the private data member. But here, how do we know? So we need to write the function definition somewhere else. So this is how we write the function definition using the scope resolution operator. Using the scope resolution operator. I'm going to define the function set name. But I'm going to tell the compiler that this set name is the same set name that appears here inside the class. So how do I tell the compiler this? By putting the name of the class followed by the double colon. So we call this operator, the double colon, the scope resolution operator. So scope resolution operator is written like this, one colon, and then followed by another colon. You press the colon button twice. بس ما جوش على سطر واحد، بس طبعا يعني حاجات ثانوية يعني جنب بعضها. أي حاجة. It's difficult to write it like this, but يعني خلاص. So this is the scope resolution operator. It tells the compiler which class this item belongs to, which means that you are allowed to write, for example, void set name. If you write void set name, and whatever string n, and you write your function, full function definition here. If you write this code, is the compiler going to understand this is the same set name that is defined in the class, inside the class? No. Is it going to be an error? No, it is not an error. It is going to define a new function outside the class that has this name. So if you call this function set name, it is going to call the global function set name. So if you want to define the body of the function that was declared inside the class, then you need to put the scope resolution operator. So this function does exactly the same thing. It takes a variable from outside the class parameter. It stores it inside the private data field inside the class. And the opposite, get name, returns the name data field private. It is returned outside the class so that we can use it in main. So let's look at this code. What does this code do? This code declares an object of type employee. Yes, of type employee. The name of which is E1. An object E1. What is the type? Class employee. Class employee has how many data fields? 2 data fields, name and wage. Name and wage. Are they public or private? Private. Private means you cannot write E1 dot name equals Ali or Ahmed, whatever. ماشي? This is wrong. Because name, even though it is a member of E1, but it is a private member. So how do we access the name field? By using the public member function. Where is the public member function? Set name. So set name takes the value Ahmed, and because we are outside the class, we cannot store it directly inside the name. So I pass it through the function set name. Set name takes set name takes the name Ahmed, and it is passed by value to string. So everything we said about functions, non-member functions, we talk about pass by value, pass parameters by reference. We talk about local and global variables. Everything is still applicable to member functions. Member functions are just like any other functions. The only difference is that they are part of a class. And this is why we need to review pass by value, pass by reference, arrays are passed by reference all the time, local and global variables. All those concepts كل هذه المبادئ that apply to functions also apply to functions that are members of classes. Right? So this is passed by value. Why? Because I don't have the reference operator. Exactly the same thing. And then it is copied here inside the name field. Type the name field of which object? And name belongs to the class definition in general. The name field of E1. يبقى هنا we're going to store here Ahmed. Here we're going to store Ahmed. In the name field of E1. Why that of E1 and not of another object? Because it is E1 object that called the function. So here when we use the dot operator, what does the dot operator imply? ماذا يعني يتبع عن استخدام الدوت operator? It means two things. It means that set name is a function, is a member function of employee. Second thing, it means access the data fields of E1. It is E1 that is, this is how we say it. E1 object is calling the member function. E1 هي التي تستدعي الفانكشن. In the past, when we did not have member function, general function, what do we say? The main function invokes يستدعي the other function. But now it is the object that calls the member function, which means that this member function is going to act upon تقوم بالتعامل مع the data fields of E1. واضح؟ So, for example, if I had another object, E2, for example, E2, is E2 going to be changed? No, because it is E1 that is calling the function. So any change will be done by on the fields of E1. Similarly here, E1.putWage, it is going to store the number 12,000. What does putWage do? It takes a variable, it takes an argument from outside the class, and it stores it through the parameter inside the object of type class. Which object? The object that called the function using the dot operator. The object that appears on the left of the dot operator of the function. So we're going to store 12,000 here. واضح؟ And then we do the opposite, which is returning values that are stored inside the object of type class. E1.getName. GetName, what does getName do? GetName returns the value of the private data field name. The private data field name of which object? Of the object that called the function, which is E1 مظبوط. So E1 is the object that called the function. E1 has the name Ahmed inside, so it is going to store the name Ahmed inside the variable name, which should be of the same type as the field, string.
With A1, not with A1 column.
أيوة بالضبط. E1 is calling the function. E1 is calling the function. This is the only new thing. Before we talked about classes and objects, the main function was invoking, was calling, يقوم باستدعاء the other function. But here, each object, for example, if I have another object, E2, and E2.getName, then it is going to apply getName on the fields of E2. But we must look which object is calling the function. So in that case, we say the object is invoking the member function. Cout name, what is it going to print? Ahmed. Makes KD, makes KD. And then cout E1.getWage, E1.getWage. For E1.getWage, this is exactly the same thing. Return the data field wage inside the object E1, which is 1200. So it is going to print it here and then per year, for example. So now we understand how to read inshallah and write code using object-oriented programming style. خلاص واضح؟ سهل. Let's look at another example. The purpose of this example is to illustrate the data abstraction concept of object-oriented programming. So we have seen two concepts until now for object-oriented programming. Encapsulation. Encapsulation, it means you put the data and the functions together in one place, which is called the class. And data abstraction. Data abstraction is hiding the data. Where is the data hidden? I can see it here. The data is hidden inside the class because it is in the default private section of the class. What is the purpose of hiding the data? The purpose of hiding the data is that the code outside the class is not affected, لا يتأثر, with any modifications, with any changes that happen inside the class. إذا قمنا بأي تغيير inside the class لن يؤثر, it does not reflect, لا ينعكس on the code outside the class. So let's look at this class. ننظف الدنيا. Let's look at the code of this class. Then I'm going to make another version, modification, and I'm going to show you that even after modification, I will not change the main program. The main program remains the same. طيب. In this class, employee class, I have three data fields, ID, age, and salary, three int data fields for each employee. And I have two member functions. I will not use the inline definition of the function, the inline approach of defining the function. So I just put the header followed by semicolon for each member function. The member functions are public, so we expect those member functions to deal with the main program, while the data fields are private by default. They are in the unnamed بدون اسم section, which is the private section if I don't mention it. Where are the definitions of those functions? Those functions are members of the employee class, so I have to start the definitions using the name of the class, then the scope resolution operator, the double semicolon, the double colon, and then the function name. This function takes three parameters. Each parameter is stored in the corresponding private data field. The member data function can access the private data field because it is a member of the same class. We can also deal with this function in the main because this function is public. So it is a member function, it can access the private data fields, and it is a public member, so it can interact with the outside of the class, outside world, outside code. Similarly, for print employee, this is a very useful function. Why? Because if we declare employee E1, for example, can we see out E1? غلط. See out is not defined for objects of type class. So how do you print the data fields? You need to print them one by one. See out ID, see out age, see out salary. But ID and age and salary are private, so we cannot write see out. يبقى see out E1 is wrong because see out does not work with entire class. طيب see out E1 dot ID is also wrong, even though ID is an int. But because ID is private, hidden inside E1, so how can we print? There are many different ways. One of the ways is to do it like the previous example. Cout E1.getWage, or a public function that reads the private data, and then we can see out. Or if you would like to see out all the data fields, then we can have a print function, public function. Public function is going to access the private data fields, the ID, age, and salary, and it is public, so it can be used inside the main, and it's going to print everything. But in that case, you don't need to write cout. Print employee already includes the cout inside it. خلاص كده واضح؟ ايوه.
ليش نبدأ نستخدم void مع نستخدم
why do I use here a void function? Because how are you going to call this function? I'm going to call this function also. So we already said this is wrong. خلاص. This is also wrong. But if you would like to call it, you call it like this: E1 dot print employee. Parentheses, because this is a function, you must put the parentheses, and then the semicolon. خلاص واضح? Did this function return anything? No return. It prints directly on the screen. So this is why I use the void function. Now I would like to make a change. خلاص, you understood the previous code? Now I will modify the code. Where is the modification that I did? This is the modification. The modification that I did is, instead of using three int variables, three separate int variables, كيفي I want to change it to be an array of three ints. ممكن ولا مش ممكن؟ ممكن. It is the same thing. Here we have three separate ints, and here I have an array of three ints. So I change the structure of the data. I change the structure of the private data. This is not a problem when I use object-oriented programming. Why? Because all the modifications will be inside the class. Let's look at this. How are we going to write the new member functions? First, is the header of the function modified? No, we don't need to modify the header of the function. The function that sets those values still takes three int parameters to store them in the data, regardless of the structure, بغض النظر عن شكل أو تركيب, the data inside the class. It must take three parameters. And the print doesn't take any parameter and doesn't return anything. It is going to print the data. This is printed as an array, but this is printed as three separate ints. So if we proceed with the modification, the original set employee function takes the three parameters and stores them into three separate variables. But the modified one takes the three parameters and stores them into three elements of the array. So inside the set employee function, we have the change. Similarly for the print. Print used to see out ID, see out age, and see out salary. Now I see out the first element of the array, see out the second element of the array, see out the third element of the array. So only the member functions inside the class understand what happened. How about the main? If I use the first definition of employee or the second definition of employee, is the main going to be changed? No change. Set employee takes three parameters. Set employee of the other type also takes three parameters. Print is the same print. Both programs get the same output. So both main programs do exactly the same thing. There is no change between version 1 and version 2. Why? because we are outside the class. The only change that happened is inside the class, So this is one of the advantages, مميزات data abstraction. When you let your data private inside the class, and you are not allowing other classes or other parts of the code to deal directly with the private data, then you can decide to change the type of that. Maybe later on I decide that salary or age should be double, not int. Then I don't need to change anything. I only need to make a modification inside the member functions. Maybe later on you decide to remove salary. I don't want to have salary. Keep the same function, but this function will not use the salary field. So the purpose of data abstraction is to make the modifications easier and limited محددة inside the class. واضح؟ سهل. طيب شكرا.